Hello again, my name is Lindsay Wargo, and I'm going to be discussing why educational and school psychologists are leaders in evidence-based interventions. According to Schaefer 2005, the evidence-based intervention movement began with the publication of the Division 12 Task Force of the APA Report on Promotion and Dissemination of Psychological Procedures. Hicks 2014 defines evidence-based interventions, or EBI, as the prevention and intervention programs that have demonstrated primary and or secondary targeted outcomes with rigorous, well-designed, and carefully specified empirical studies. EBIs are typically determined by a variety of investigations that report on various dependent measures and usually involve precise examination of data replicated across time, context, setting, and researchers. Given the persistent trends regarding the lack of appropriate supports provided to approximately one-fifth of students in the United States, adoption of evidence-based interventions is imperative. For the sake of children's mental health, the science-to-practice gap must be addressed. Within recent years, educational and school psychologists have been identified as leaders in EBI adoption efforts for a number of reasons. Given the extensive training of mental health and educational outcomes, school psychologists are uniquely qualified to provide leadership in the promotion, adoption, implementation, and continuation of EBIs in schools. They have become leaders in evidence-based interventions not only because of their extensive knowledge in the area, but also because they are ethically required by the National Association of School Psychologists. The Principles of Professional Ethics 2016 states school psychologists use interventions, counseling and therapy procedures, consultation techniques, and other direct or indirect service methods that the profession considers to be responsible research-based practice. Further, the standards specifically suggest that a problem-solving process should be used to develop interventions that are appropriate to the presenting problems and consistent with data collected. Preference should always be given to interventions that are described in peer-reviewed literature and found to be effective. According to the book Ethics and Law for School Psychologists, the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 and IDEA also called on school psychologists to utilize evidence-based academic and behavioral interventions. The text states that in order to meet the criteria of evidence-based, the intervention must propose a statistically significant effect on improving outcomes based on strong evidence from at least one well-designed and implemented experimental study, modern evidence from at least one quasi-experimental study, or promising evidence from at least one well-designed and implemented correlational study that controls for bias. If the intervention does not demonstrate statistically significant effect based on those things, then its rationale must be based on high-quality research findings or positive evaluation that such activity, strategy, or intervention is likely to improve student outcomes. Although school psychologists should give inclination to evidence-based interventions, they should also adjust the intervention to the specific setting and individual needs of the student. School psychologists should continuously monitor the effectiveness of their intervention plans and make modification if progress is not being made. In addition to their knowledge and ethical obligation, educational and school psychologists are leaders in evidence-based interventions because they simply realize how effective they are and they want to make a difference in the lives of as many young children as possible. Further, their practices of multifaceted evaluations, sophisticated measurement tools, and consideration of ecological context typically facilitates evidence-based interventions. As system-level problem solvers, educational and school psychologists are well prepared to fill the role of selection and implementation of EBIs, targeting students at the universal, selective, or indicative levels of prevention support. Although evidence-based interventions are highly effective and necessary in order to address the research-to-practice gap, the implementation of these strategies into school settings is often easier said than done. According to Schaefer 2005, lack of funds is a common barrier in the implementation of EBIs. Because protocols and manuals are often expensive, specifically if they require additional training or support, the necessary implementation may be careless or not implemented at all if left up to school personnel. In addition, mental health professionals are required to obtain protocols on their own and often must contact the developers directly. There's also difficulty in selecting an evidence-based intervention because there's no way to assess and compare all the interventions at once. Another barrier is the reluctance of teachers, school staff, parents, etc. Many school personnel are not aware of EBIs or have misconceptions about what they entail. In addition, interventions often require the participation of teachers, school staff, or parents who may lack the training necessary to carry out these evidence-based interventions, may lack confidence in their ability to learn the necessary skills, or simply be resistant to the process of change in general. The persistent research to practice gap is a continuous reminder of the difficulties that accompany the implementation of evidence-based interventions. Although a number of barriers exist in the implementation of EBIs, there are strategies that can help to diminish these difficulties. The National Institute of Mental Health suggests that the adoption of change depends on favorable attitudes or intention to change, requisite skills, and the absence of environmental constraint. Schaefer, 2005, discusses a number of factors that can act as levers in promoting these three conditions, which include consumer demand for service, education, local peer influences, financial incentive and penalties, administrative rules and regulations, and feedback on practice patterns. In addition, Torrey et al., 2001, examines three principles that promote the adoption of evidence-based interventions in school. So first, all stakeholders, so program staff, school staff, parents, and youth, should be included in the process of identification and implementation. Second, involvement of stakeholders should be enacted at all stages of the change process, including identifying the problem, selecting interventions, motivating and educating for change, implementing the practice into routines, and participating in quality assurance activities. Lastly, the intensity of efforts must be maintained under the assumption that successful implementation will be associated with a number of stakeholders and implementation components that are enlisted and continue to be involved in the program. Change is a fragile process that is effective only when properly facilitated, and although humans are motivated to change for a variety of reasons, the act of change is typically an uncomfortable one. The article titled Theories of Change and Adoption of Interventions, the Evolving Evidence-Based Intervention and Practice Movement in School Psychology, discusses design models that are aimed to facilitate change as well as ensure that the change is carefully implemented and understood by all individuals involved. The author argues that following these change models will help to promote the adoption of EBIs into educational settings. The article discusses 7 models and theories, but for the sake of time, I'm going to briefly touch on the 2 that I found most relevant. A specific theory of social influence developed by Cialdini, 2001, is based upon several core principles: commitment and consistency, reciprocation, instant influence or primitive automaticity, social proof, liking, authority, and scarcity. So commitment and consistency relates to compliance and that people are more willing to cooperate with requests that are compatible with a previous commitment. Reciprocation refers to the norm that one person tries to repay what another person has provided, which pertains to school psychology, and that a teacher may comply with a request if they feel indebted to the school psychologist for the services they have provided. Instant influence or primitive authority relates to a shortcut approach where decisions to comply are based off of a single and reliable piece of information. Social proof can be used as a way to increase teachers' compliance by informing them that many other teachers have been implementing this intervention. The rule of liking suggests that people are more likely to say yes to an individual that they know and like, which is why it is important for a school psychologist to build relationships and trust with the teachers they are working with. Authority refers to a decision-making shortcut based on the assumption regarding the authority's knowledge and power. So if a school psychologist is seen as prestigious and knowledgeable, teachers and school personnel are more likely to cooperate. The scarcity principle suggests that people tend to see more value in opportunities when they are less available. So it is suggested that school psychologists convey that what they are offering is restricted by amount or time. The second relevant theory is Rogers' innovation diffusion theory, which is based on his research of successful and unsuccessful adoptions of innovations. He proposed 5 stages in the innovation decision-making process, which include knowledge, persuasion, implementation, reinvention, and confirmation. He also considers 5 characteristics that account for the rate of adoption, which are relative change, compatibility, complexity, trialability, and observability. Relative advantage refers to the degree in which an intervention is seen to provide a greater advantage than the current situation. Compatibility relates to whether the intervention is matched to the target individual's state. Complexity corresponds to how difficult the implementation and continuation of the intervention is perceived to be. Trialability refers to whether an intervention can be incorporated on a limited trial basis. And observability relates to the degree in which an individual can directly see the results of an intervention. This diffusion research provides information on how to get individuals to adopt research-based interventions through a better understanding of the fundamental mechanisms of adoption innovation. So in closing, evidence-based interventions are highly needed in order to address the persisting research to practice gap. Due to their extensive training, ethical obligations, and typical procedures of assessment, educational and school psychologists have become leaders in the evidence-based intervention movement. As a means of better assisting the needs of all children, educational psychologists are evaluating and providing research on the most effective EPIs, while school psychologists are striving to directly implement these practices into school settings. Although the implementation and continuation of these interventions is difficult, researchers have provided a number of strategies to alleviate these barriers and increase the evidence-based interventions in every school. Thank you.